I said, I'm interested in finding out more about this. If all these folks were getting up and leaving, it must be something interesting. I got an interview with Ed Akabuchi, and I got the job. And a couple weeks later, I basically left IBM and went to work for Citrix in Coral Springs.
1995 WinFrame 1.5, it was probably on 20 floppy disks, probably. They came in a box,
Yeah.
right? Right. I just remember those days for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so now the timing is great because August 95, you launched this thing. It's out there, tons of press. Citrix is going crazy. And then what do you know? The IPO is scheduled for December.
Oh, that was an exciting time. Understatement. This was our ultimate goal, was to go public. And not many companies succeeded at this. And, we did. Microsoft announced that they were not going to renew our license starting with NT 4.0. Microsoft announced this to the world through a press release. And at the same time, they announced that they had acquired multi-user technology from another company, not Citrix, but another company called Prolog. It's a French-based company, and that Microsoft was going to create their own version of multi-user based on that code. And Citrix was, hung up, left to die, basically. This was disaster, of course, and the stock, cratered.
So hello, Brad Peterson. So I'm truly honored to have you on the show today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling energized.
Excellent, because it's going to take a ton of energy to get through this story because it's so amazing. So I know a lot of people have known you in the past for sure, but they don't know all the details and they love to hear that sort of stuff. We're going to dig in. Now, before we dive in, yes, you heard that right. Today's guest is Brad Peterson, and I'm Brad Peterson. I know it's the same name, it's slightly different spelling, and no, I won't be interviewing myself today, all right? So listen, I would like to welcome our listeners to a very special show as we're joined by someone whose work helped shape the modern era of enterprise computing. Brad Peterson was employee number 7 at Citrix and a founding member of their software design and dev team. He holds 40 issued U.S. patents, including several on the ICA protocol, which we all know and love, and that's a groundbreaking innovation that powered virtual desktops long before cloud computing was a buzzword. His work didn't just solve a technical problem, it helped spark a global movement and a passionate community that still is thriving today. Now, today we're going to talk 25 years of Citrix timeline, the evolution of Citrix products and product names, the IPO, the acquisitions, the retirement, and the future of tech. It is going to be an amazing conversation. So welcome, Brad. I got to thank you again for joining us today. It's just going to be this great story, and a whole lot of folks are going to love hearing it.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me, Brad. Oh, we hear my dogs in the background.
Oh, well, they sound happy to have you online as well. Yes, that sounds like a happy bark to me. Hey, before we jump into the history, though, I want to kind of set the mark here so folks that maybe aren't as familiar can be familiar with your accomplishments and so forth. So the first thing really is, when you take a look at your LinkedIn page. Now, this is amazing because only the most amazing people in the world can have a LinkedIn page that has so little information on it, right? It's like kind of a drop the mic LinkedIn page. Okay, you went out of school out of Minnesota. You were a lead software engineer, 6 years in Fort Lauderdale at Harris. And then you thought, the PCs are really coming around. I got to go get into IBM. And then within 6 months, all these folks start popping over to a new startup company called Citrix, of course, right? Mm-hmm. And you had to change the name to Citrix later, but they sucked you into there. And 25 and a half years later, history is made. And listen, it's so amazing. You've already been retired for 10 years. It's kind of crazy how fast time has gone. Yeah. But the accomplishments that happened in those years are what we're going to cover today in great detail. And also, you should know before we even get started, VP, Chief Architect, and Senior Fellow, of course. But as we said in the intro, it's also super amazing and crazy that you have 40 issued U.S. patents. And so you can see all of those listed out here, like who has that, right? Like not very many people. So congratulations on all this. And I got to tell you, I can't wait to get this thing started. So I was thinking, Why don't we go back to February 1990 when it all started?
Yeah, like you were saying, I'd gone to IBM, and it was really because I decided, the PCs were starting to make, uh, be a legit business, for businesses, and the IBM PC was created and developed originally out of Boca Raton, Florida, and I happened to live, uh, about 10 miles from that office location. So it sounded very interesting to me to be able to go work in that office and get involved with the IBM, the PC industry. Up until that point, I had been working on super mini computers at Harris Computer Systems, and primarily operating systems and device drivers, low level type work. Harris was a manufacturer of these super mini computers, and it was interesting. But the PC revolution was starting, and it sounded like a great time to get into it. So I got a job in Boca and in the OS2 group, and OS2 is being developed jointly with between Microsoft and IBM. It was a joint development effort, and I was in the architect group at IBM. An OS2 architecture group, and I was working with a bunch of folks who, after about being there 6 months, they told me they were leaving, and I asked them why, and they really wouldn't say. It was a big hush hush. It was a secret what they were going to, and it turned out it was Citrix at the time that they were leaving, and there was about 4 or 5 different individuals that I had been working with, on a pretty regular day-to-day basis that left. And I said, I'm interested in finding out more about this. Even though I really didn't know what it was about, if all these folks were getting up and leaving, it must be something interesting. So I got an interview with Ed Akabuchi, interviewed me, and I got the job. And a couple weeks later, I'd basically left IBM and went to work for Citrix in Coral Springs. Our initial offices were in Coral Springs, and it happened that office was 2 miles from my house. So it was an amazing, coincidence that it was so close. And actually, I could walk to work if I wanted to at that point. And this was the original group. As this date, this is February. I actually joined in December. So this is a couple of months after that point. And we'd hired a few more folks in that time frame. But this was the group, and this group stayed relatively fixed for, I don't know, a good year until we got, the first product out and started making some little bit of money at the company.
Well, point out some of the folks in the picture here, some of the main characters.
Well, the main, founder was Ed Akabuchi, and he's in the back, on the very back with a beard, black hair, glasses. And Ed was the visionary. He had, it was his baby as far as the technology goes. And he also had the relationships with Microsoft, because this initial product that we're working on was based on OS2. And that's why it was so key that all these people came out of the OS2 group. I think everyone in this group, except for like one of the engineers, came out of OS2. And we all brought very deep OS2 knowledge to this group. And with the source code license that Ed arranged through Microsoft, because remember OS2 was a joint development between IBM and Microsoft, he was able to get the source code. And we started with OS2, early versions of OS2. I'm just, we took that source code of OS2, and OS2 being traditionally a single user, one computer, one user, one keyboard, one mouse type of thing. And our goal was, and this is why the company eventually was called Citrus, because it was Citrix after Citrus. Citrix was a combination of Unix and the original Citrus, but Unix, and the reason Unix was we were going after that Unix market. What we wanted to do is make a multi-user version of OS/2 that could compete with Unix in small businesses.
Got it, because Sun Microsystems was out then with their workstations everywhere.
Yep, and this was even lower end. We wanted to go into small businesses instead of at the current time. I mean, if a business wanted to use computers, they'd have to buy one computer for each user to be able to run the different apps that they wanted. And our goal was they would buy one computer, a bit bigger, and then run 5 users or terminals, 5 terminals from that one computer. And this is why small business, because you could have a relatively small number of employees. And we would run text. Now, this is key. It was text-based OS/2 applications. So there was a spreadsheet, there was a word processor, and there were business apps that were available for OS/2, and they were text-based. So we were able to make OS/2 multi-user, and then with serial ports and multi-serial ports, like Digiboard was a name of a product, and a company actually. They made these multi-port serial boards that you plug into the computer, and then you run cables to multiple, like 5 different terminals or 10 different terminals. And these are just dumb terminals, V200s, televideos. They were the traditional terminals that came out of the Unix marketplace, and they were just text-based terminals, but the screens could be addressed. So you could draw text-based boxes but it was all line drawing, but it was all character-based, no graphics.
And the terminals were significantly cheaper than buying a big PC per person. So you net it out and you're getting your per user cost down. The same exact argument for VDI today and DAS and so on.
Yeah, it was all cost play. The whole pitch was this is cheaper, and you can do everything that you could do with instead of buying 5-10 PCs, you buy this one with some terminals and save a lot of money.
And so the organization here was heavy in engineering. You can see that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you look at this, I don't know if you. This is actually in mid-year, so this is about 6 months after the company was underway, because we really got going at the very December of '89, so about 6 months later, and the whole team that's there under Glenn Hamlin. Glenn was the head of VP of engineering. He came out of IBM also, but that was everyone under him was writing code. If you didn't write code, you weren't in you weren't in the engineering department. Everyone was hands-on. Everyone had to be pulling their own weight, and every one of these folks were good at what they did. They really were.
Crack team. And then the little asterisk at the bottom, by June 1990, you guys are already at a trade show?
Yeah, that was interesting. It obviously was pre-product. We didn't have any products until the following year. So it wasn't even beta yet. It was alpha. I mean, it was early code. And we had this secret, and truly it was secret. In hindsight, it didn't work very well, but we had this secret demo room where people could come by invite only and see the product. Okay, by the end of the show, we were pulling people from the hallways into the room trying to get them to see it. I think we had our expectations were a little were unrealistic initially. About
they had no idea what it was.
People didn't know what this was. Who's Citrus, or I think we had changed the name by this time to Citrix. But who's Citrix? What is this? And no one could really understand it until they saw it, and that was ended up being for 20 years with Citrix, people had to see it in order to understand it, the product. You really had to, but in the early days, that was really the case because this just didn't make sense. People were used to PCs, and we were doing strange things to PCs.
Well, hey, this is 6 months later. You already had a release here, I see, right? This
Yep.
looks like February 1st, 1991.
Yep. That was the very first product. And this product, it was fairly straightforward. Just like I was saying, it was text-based terminals, and then it based on OS2. The core was OS2. It was text, and we ran text-based OS2 apps. The trouble was, like 2 days or a day before we announced this product, IBM and Microsoft announced they were splitting. They were no longer going to work on this product jointly. And Microsoft basically said, we're going to go off and do our own thing with Windows. Because they were having success with Windows 3, 3X, 3.1, and so forth. And they decided they really didn't want to invest anymore in this OS2 thing. And like I said, this was right before we announced this product. So we had all that bad press in the background while we were trying to make this product. And, it was OS2 based and it required OS2 applications. And all of a sudden, it lost half its backing, with Microsoft leaving.
So then IBM would be the only developer and support for OS2 going forward, but no Microsoft. And Microsoft's got another OS now they're working on. So what are you guys thinking at this point?
We were thinking we better chase the apps. We need to support the apps, the applications that businesses care about. And in this time frame, it was not OS2 text-based apps. And that's what we supported with this product. So we had to figure out, okay, how do we fix this? How do we, become relevant? And so the first thing we did, luckily, OS2 had a VM or VDM that could run DOS apps. Okay, again, text-based. And we started working on a product that added DOS support. This was going to ultimately be multi-user 2.0, the follow-on to this product. And so we added DOS text apps. We actually created the very first, I will call it ICA 1.0 client. We actually created a serial client, and it was called multi-user link. And we created a network client that supported IPX being a protocol's Novell protocol. I'll get back to that. And NetBEUI, which was ultimately, that was supported by OS2, and that's more of a Microsoft protocol. But OS2, the product supported that. So at this point, we now had a product that could run the OS2 text-based apps, but no one really cared about those. But DOS apps, and in particular DOS text apps. And another important thing we did at this point, we actually added remote access. And this was actually ended up being key. I mean, because ultimately this is why Citrix succeeded. We added support for modems. And back in this time frame, the modems were very slow. I mean, they were like 300 baud, or if you're lucky, 1200, and they were dial-up over the phone lines. Because it's hard to really realize it at this point, but the internet didn't exist at this point. This was pre-internet, so the way people connected was through modems and through telephone lines. And so we added support for modems, and now people could same idea. You install a server in the office, and you could connect to it now remotely. So you could be in a hotel room, and you could connect and run your DOS applications. And there were a lot of DOS text-based applications. That was actually most prevalent in the in the small businesses at that time, much more so than OS2 based apps.
So you weren't limited to just the folks that could drive into the office and kind of sit down the table or the bench from the server with some cables. Now you could come in from anywhere. Yeah, in 1991 was the super slow modems. I think it was 1993 that the internet really just came about. I think that was the first
Yep.
year I put a second line in the house and a modem with a full-time connection to the internet, and it was 1200, 2400 baud probably. Now you guys from here created and probably announced at Citrix NetWorld something that may have been alpha or beta also, but that was application server.
This was actually another critical. There were so many critical moments along, the life of early Citrix. We made a licensing deal. So we had the OS2 source code, and we actually had DOS source code in order to allow us to do this multi-user DOS OS2 thing. This became kind of a strange product because we kind of hid the fact that it was OS2, because OS2 was getting a bad rep with Microsoft, basically bad mouthing it all the time and pushing Windows. So we really didn't want to even admit that it was OS2 based, but it was our core operating system was OS2, but it ran DOS, and so we pitched as DOS apps. Then we made a licensing deal with Novell. Now Novell was huge. They owned the networking space at this time. So Novell had NetWare, which provided file sharing and it was the first networking file servers in the industry, and Novell had all that in the products, and we licensed that code and integrated that into OS2 so we could be a client. So now you could dial in through a modem, and through that modem you would connect and run DOS apps, which would then connect to a Novell and run Novell apps. And so you could run client-server apps using the Novell NetWare back end, and they had databases. And this is all early client-server, and business were swallowing this up left and right. I mean, it was very, very popular. It was the way to run. So we provided remote access to all the apps that you cared about. And up until this point, a lot of these businesses really didn't have a good way of, if you weren't in the office, you couldn't run these apps, and not very well.
So you guys are launching it here. And as we see at this event, you put the jacket and tie on and you were out there doing demos.
Yeah, this is as it said there, NetWorld. And you can see all the terminals. I mean, some of those were PCs, some of those were terminals. You can see the two on the left, I look like PCs to me. And we were running a combination of terminals and, our client, early ICA 1.0 client, and dial up, and a combination of different things.
Were customers starting to get it at this point?
They did when you showed it to them. And it's kind of funny, right in front of me, underneath the, you can see the computers. That's how big they were. Under the monitors, the beige box. But most of them were pretty good size. But yeah, at this point we finally had, and you could do printing too, and so, but we finally had a product that customers really had a need for, and things really started taking off here. It was a little bit of hodgepodge, and we came out with another product. I think we called it Multi-User Net Connect for NetWare. Then another product called A+ Remote, which started integrating all these different, the Novell support and the DOS support and the modem, all that, integrating it more cleanly and just improving upon the product overall.
And this is laid out well in the trade show space. You got a monitor over a computer, and that's like, this is what you would expect. But then you have all these terminals sitting over here.
Yeah.
Well, look, there's no computer under them.
Exactly.
They just all connect in and they share this thing that you paid a lot of money for.
Yeah.
And then remote access. Look at that. 1992, you got remote access and WAN performance out there.
Yeah. I mean, we were starting to move up a little bit in the size of companies we're going after. More larger companies that actually had multiple offices, and those offices were connected with WANs, wide area networks. But those wide area networks were pretty slow in those days. And using our product here, Citrix's product, we could actually treat that as remote access. It just happens to be that you're using a WAN, for your remote access.
And it's interesting, you built the protocols back when the networks were slow and had a lot of latency. So you had to be to the byte, precise and efficient with those protocols to make it usable. And then later in life, when the networks opened up a little wider, those same efficient protocols were just better than anyone else.
Yeah. In the very early days, the protocols were pretty basic compared to, ICA today. But because in this time frame, it was still text-based. And remoting text applications is, 100 times easier than graphics. But that was the next evolution of Citrix was graphics. Because basically, our goal was to support the apps that enterprises and companies used to run their business. Okay, so at this point, Microsoft was getting headway into these companies with Windows, in particular Windows 3.1. And there's a Windows work group, which is basically Windows 3.1 that supported networking. And so that was really our next step. And another license deal, and this happened with Microsoft, we actually licensed Windows 3.1. So we had we had more source code than we knew what to do with, because we had the OS2 source code, we had DOS source code, now we had Windows 3.1 source code. Now, luckily, we didn't have to change DOS or Windows 3.1 source code. We basically used them as a reference to understand how things worked, because we were doing something that no one or no other company had done, was making these things multi-user, remoting them, We needed to run multiple copies of Windows on one PC using the DOS box, because Windows 3.1 ran on top of DOS. If you remember, you had to boot DOS first and then you ran Windows. So we had a product that already supported DOS. So our goal now was to add Windows support. Okay, but how do you remote Windows? Now, there were products in the market like PC Anywhere that did remote control and they were there pretty early, but it was a 1-to-1, one PC to one PC. There was no sharing, no multi-user. It was just strictly remote access, and performance was, okay, but nothing great. It worked.
But not a full business model, more of a support or even maintenance model. In 1992, this looks like the team here. The team's growing, but this is the network team. Is that right?
These are all, I'm just looking at who's in this picture. These are all employees, Citrix employees. Roger Roberts at the end of the table, he was critical. He was the first, CEO of the company. And he ran a tight ship. And he was good for the company. He put a little bit of, before he joined, it was a little bit probably too much free for all, but he joined pretty early, and he made sure he counted the numbers, counted the dollars, dollars in, dollars out, sales, everything. He was on top of it, and he, like I said, it was because of that, that we were able to, keep moving forward, and turn product into sales, and then the revenue and funding, because even at this point we were still getting funding from investors. We had a product that did OS2, based on OS2, ran DOS text apps, but now we had to add graphics, and this became the first version of this was basically created the first version of ThinWire. And I want to credit Jeff Krantz. He's third from the left on this picture. Jeff created the first ICA graphics protocol called ThinWire, and it was ICA 2.0, the ThinWire protocol for ICA 2.0. And then I created the rest of the protocol, or a lot of it, not 100%. And with that graphic support, we updated our clients, the ICA clients, to support graphics. And at this point, then the team added Windows 3.1 support on the server, and now we could run graphics. In particular, we can run Windows 3.1 applications remotely. And this was a huge step forward because it really opened the market. And the first product, it was an add-on product that added graphics. It was called WinCredible, which interesting marketing. And that was November of '92.
Before we get too far, everybody knows ICA and they throw it around, but what the heck does it mean? And did it have different meanings over the years?
Yeah. So I think the history has gotten a little bit lost over the years, but it was definitely created by Ed Akabuchi very, very early on. And it initially stood for, the ICA stood for Independent Council Architecture. And why council? Well, the early products were all about, making a single user computer multi-user. And so it's kind of, making that council that you're normally council being a monitor in this case, independent, and be able to have multiple consoles all, back to the same computer. So that's where it originated from. And then at some point, and I think it was pretty early, within the first few years, someone decided, and it was probably Ed, that instead of using the word console, computing sounded better. So ICA, Independent Computing Architecture. So it kind of morphed into that. So when marketing really got a hold of it in those later years, or after after the first few years, that's what they really pushed and that's what I think most people are familiar with, because that's what it goes by today, Independent Computing Architecture.
That is the one that's sort of shared. There's always been this mystery and the suspicion that it had something else. So it was console, right? And
Yeah.
so, but you kind of called those monitors terminals before, but it certainly wasn't the independent terminal architecture.
No. Terminal sounded a little too old-fashioned, and I think that's what happened with the word console too, and got replaced by computing. But the early products were all terminal-based. Basically dumb terminals connected to a central computer, but it was effectively remoting the console of that computer out to those terminals.
Got it. Yeah, and I think that made a lot of sense. And what year do you remember that being when they converted it over to computing architecture?
Early '90s. I really can't pin it down, but it was early.
Way back in the beginning. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So the independent console architecture didn't have much of a life. That's cool.
No.
Hey, so do you remember then the moment where they coined the term HDX, what that stood for?
Well, that was strictly marketing. Okay, engineering had nothing to do with that. In fact, we were confused for a while because they basically, tagged, was it a rename of ICA? Is that what it is? And some people, I think, still think that. What it really was about was broadening the message. ICA was a protocol. HDX was much more. It was, the experience and the different features that went along with the protocol that gave you a bigger experience, more features, more rich, environment. So HDX was just trying to broaden the ICA term to something more.
The added advantages that were provided when you had that Citrix receiver experience beyond just the protocol itself, the other wonderful things that it did.
And then ICA was delegated to be, when you said ICA, you meant the protocol and only the protocol.
Yeah, and that was the ICA RDP, sort of battle forever, limited to the protocol war.
Yeah.
and HDX took the fight just sort of a little higher. That's the way we kind of spun it. And we kind of
Yep.
called it the high definition user experience. That was
Yep.
HDX.
Exactly. And like I was saying, it was marketing, but it's reality. I mean, it was backed up by real technology.
I think the next generation threw the HDX term around more because that was more prevalent then, and the
Yeah.
early folks knew ICA and loved it and hung on to that term.
Yeah, ICA became kind of techie, and marketing stopped talking about it, and instead, like you were saying, referenced HDX as the bigger story, bigger message.
Exactly. All right. Well, hey, thanks for solving that mystery.
Oh, no problem.
Now here you are in '94, so a lot's changed in 4 years.
Yeah, hired, grew the company. We were growing engineering, but we were definitely growing the other parts of the company too. Support, sales, marketing. So the entire company was growing at this point. We took all this, the WinCredible add-on and created a product called WinView, and that may be the first product that a lot of people are aware of, from Citrix, because WinView was, rightly, it was a fairly successful product, and it was that product, WinView, that really, built the revenue within the company that ultimately let the company go public. It served as a huge stepping stone into the next chapter of the company, because WinView was really the last product that was based on OS2.
And here's just a glimpse, I guess, of maybe the whole company in '94 up on the rooftop.
And it was WinView is the main product to this point. And yes, this is the entire company. And so you can see that it's much more than just engineering at this point. In the early days, the company was 90% engineering and 10% other. Now it's much more balanced with marketing and sales and support and different finance and you name it. You had all the typical departments here.
And just a point of reference, this was 31 years ago.
Wow. Yeah, time flies.
Yeah, time flies. So, hey, now here we get into the timeline. So a lot of this you talked about, but you can kind of skim through and talk about the evolution of the products, the product names.
Yeah. If there's one thing Citrix liked was to change the product name. And, I think after about a year or 2 years of the same name, someone got bored and had to change the name to something new. But as you can see, I was talking about in the early days, multi-user, that was all the OS2 text-based stuff. And then, NetConnect for NetWare, that was when we added the Novell NetWare support for networking. WinCredible, as I mentioned, was the graphics, particular Windows 3.1 applications.
And by the way, that name, you realize, WinCredible, this is 12 years before The Incredibles came out, the movie, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought we should just take a moment and recognize the fact that you guys came a dozen years earlier, and it wasn't just Incredible, it was ICA Incredible. So well done. I know marketing does their part and engineering does their part, of course. And I think, we should recognize that, right?
That's interesting picture you got there.
So then you go on to the WinView naming convention.
Yeah. And WinView, initially we had a product that you kind of install a core, and then you added all these different add-ons. You added, support for Novell. You added support, for Windows and graphics and so forth. And we started pulling all that together and cleaning it up and making it a much smoother, streamlined product. And that was the whole WinView thing. But what's interesting, you can see there in '94, TCP for WinView. This was actually the very first time we supported TCP. I mean, we take TCP kind of for granted now, but up until this point, we did not even support TCP. We were focused on Novell, or NetWare protocols, and that's IPX and SPX. But TCP was emerging at this point. In '94, the internet was starting to take off, and we needed to support TCP because companies started caring about it. And we actually made a licensing deal with a company called FTP. FTP was actually big in the early TCP days. They had some add-on products that added on, FTP support or TCP support to Windows, and we had licensed that from FTP software, and then added the OS2 stack to. This is still OS2, so we added to OS2. So now you could log in and you could access applications that use TCP/IP. And the internet was starting to, I think, about this same time frame on Netscape was created, Netscape Navigator, and companies are starting to use that early days.
Yeah, the Netscape browser.
Yep.
I guess, which came before Mozilla and various other things. And yeah, so that's the time when the internet came out, modems, companies were starting to attach to the internet as well. And so TCP/IP protocol obviously is like it's time, it's perfect timing. And look at the bottom of the slide, won best of show at Networld plus Interop. So you're starting to get the recognition.
Yeah, people recognized it. We were solving a problem that did not have decent solutions prior to Citrix and WinView. And so WinView, you could, everything you did in your small to, even to larger companies, for your business in your office, we could provide remote access to that and run those same applications and get, decent performance. And there really weren't good solutions to do that in a cost-effective way. And that's what we offered here.
So let's shift gears now to the next step, the NT team.
Yep. So interesting. WinView was starting to get a good, sales was having good luck with it, selling it. Revenue, Citrix was growing very, very rapidly at this point. But Ed, I'll credit Ed Akabuchi in particular, knew that OS2 had its, if we stayed in OS2, we were going to die eventually. Even though we were hiding the fact that OS2 was under the covers, we still were reliant on OS2. And so he, actually it was in probably about 92, Ed had went back to Microsoft, and he had very good connections at Microsoft, and licensed the source code to Windows NT. Now NT, as I mentioned earlier, IBM and Microsoft split and went their own ways, and Microsoft was going to go invest on Windows, and OS2 continued on OS2, and IBM, initially or eventually came out with Warp, which was a follow-on to OS2, but it was OS2 based, and Microsoft started investing in this new operating system called Windows NT. And so this was going to be the follow-on to Windows 3.1. And Microsoft went and basically created a new team headed up by Dave Cutler that brought a lot of experience to Microsoft and a small team also. And they created, NT from scratch. And that was what we'd licensed, Citrix had licensed. So we had gotten, I think the first NT that we got from Microsoft was Windows, and prior to NT 3.1. It was an NT 3.0, I believe, but it hadn't really been released. This is early days, very early days with Windows NT. And we got the source code in approximately 92. And it came on this 5-inch SCSI drive. It's this brick of a disk drive, and it came in the mail. And basically, we had to go and buy a SCSI adapter and boards and be able to get it copied onto a computer so we could start working on it. And initially, it was myself and Mike Discavage. Mike was a great engineer that was great at debugging, and and that was critical here, because what we had to do, we had to figure out how NT worked. There was almost no documentation that we had. So we basically had the source code to it. Luckily, the code at that point was fairly well documented, so that helped. But you have thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands lines of code. You can't just go read it all and then understand it. That just doesn't work that way. So we had to figure out, basically you run it, you get it installed, and you would debug through it. You'd see what's running, you'd put breakpoints, but you reverse engineer it. And you figure out, how does this thing work? And what we needed to do was, again, make it multi-user. What we found was that a lot of the low level code in NT was already written to be multi-user. The Cutler's team, they came from a VMS background, which is multi-user. And so when they created NT initially, a lot of the core was multi-user. The low level kernel. And I'm talking, this is code that normally no one sees because it's very low level. And this code, so that helped us a lot. But then on top of that kernel was all these different subsystems that made up Windows. Because the whole goal of NT was to run Windows 3.1 apps, or to be compatible. And so they had all these subsystems, and none of that was multi-user. It was all one display, one user, and so we figured out how we could run multiple instances of those subsystems, one subsystem per user. And within that subsystem, it was, ran the desktop and ran the graphics subsystem and everything. And we figured out how to do that, and that was our goal. And myself and Mike did a lot of this early work. Jeff Krantz was involved because we had to create another ICA thinwire. Graphics remoting is always a challenge, and Jeff was our expert on that. And then Kurt Perry, we had to have new clients, ICA clients, and Kurt was that. And Butch, admin tools, we had to have administrative tools to administer this thing when we got the code done. And John Richardson was a very deep kernel guy. He lived and breathed OS2 kernels, low level, and this team built up over time. It wasn't this everyone here initially, day one, but as we got further progressed, we built up the team. And so all this was going on in parallel. Meanwhile, we still had the majority of engineering working on WinView, coming out with another version of WinView. Sales was selling WinView. This was all hush hush in the background. We didn't want to screw up sales, with the next product that was, being developed until we were ready. And so this all happened in the background. And eventually, our first beta was South Beach. It was called South Beach, is what we named. And South Beach is actually a beach down in Miami area. And I'm not sure why South Beach was picked, but it was. And that was in 95, early 95. That was a beta kind of level. It wasn't, South Beach was never sold, but it was the first taste of the product that we could give to customers or people to try.
And so that was a couple of years into development then, from 93 to 95.
Yeah, it was a big project. It took a couple of years. Meanwhile, the company was doing, just fine on WinView, which is great. This was a huge transition. It was non-trivial, to kind of, because we had a successful product, WinView, and we needed to replicate everything it could do in this new product. And these product transitions are hard because you never can be 100%. So when you start selling the new product, ideally you want to stop selling the old one because you just don't have the resources to do both, and it confuses the market. But if you don't have all the features, then customers get pissed off, and you can't transition them, and it gets tricky.
Every company goes through that. And by the way, if you don't do the transition, you're caught in the past, and it
Yeah.
gets even worse. So it's a necessary challenge to your day for sure. And you guys had sort of pivoted and adjusted accordingly, which kept you alive and then ultimately massively successful. And this is a look at what it looked like in '96 to actually be working on this stuff. It's kind of funny, you got your PC there
Yeah.
and your monitor, and the fact that you could be as productive as you were without four screens, thin, this and 4K monitors and stuff. Somehow on that low res world, you were able to crank out all that code.
That came later. But yeah, yeah, we forget how primitive, really, these old CRTs. You had to be good at remembering because you had a small window into the code and what you were working on.
Well, and that's exactly the thing, because you had to switch between these things. So you had to remember. I don't even know if there was effective cut and paste as much. I'm sure there was a bit of that. But
Yeah.
nowadays, with 4 high resolution monitors, you got 6 things open at the same time. You don't have to remember anything.
Yeah.
So well done. Now we got a little more timeline here. So a little talk on, like you mentioned, South Beach, 1995, the first release. And then, WinFrame comes out.
Yeah, WinFrame was the very first NT-based product, and you see that was 95, and that was based on NT351. Now, what was unique about this WinFrame was that it included everything. When we shipped WinFrame, it included NT as part of the product, because we had the source code license, and we made actual changes into that NT source code to make it multi-user, and then we rebuilt it and made that, and that was what a customer purchased. So the customer did not have to buy anything from Microsoft at this point. We paid a royalty to Microsoft for every copy we sold, so Microsoft still made money, but we were the ones selling and supporting NT. So if a customer had an issue, it was Citrix's responsibility to debug NT. It wasn't that the customer went to Microsoft to debug this problem, even though it was in the core NT kernel. And that's why we needed some NT kernel expertise in the house, because it was our responsibility, Citrix's responsibility to make this work top to bottom.
And then if you had issues, Citrix could go to Microsoft.
Yeah, but that happened occasionally, but surprisingly little.
So you guys knew it so well, you were pretty much self-sufficient.
Well, we were kind of forced. I mean, it wasn't like we had all the phone numbers to all of the Microsoft NT engineers. No, we never talked to any of those direct, never. When we had an issue with NT that we thought Microsoft needed to be aware of, we went through their support, through Microsoft support, just like a customer would. Now, it was probably streamlined a little bit, I hope, but it wasn't like we were talking with their engineers.
You talk to support, and rarely could they talk at the level you guys, your question was at the depth, right? So hopefully they got you to the right folks. It's interesting, the timing here. By the way, 1995 WinFrame 1.5, it was probably on 20 floppy disks, probably. They came in a box,
Yeah.
right? And one at a time, you jammed them in there and you got the whole thing installed. And you probably had to do it 2 or 3 times to get it, all the sequence right. I just remember those days for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so now the timing is great, because August '95, you launched this thing. It's out there, tons of press. Citrix is going crazy, and then what do you know? The IPO is scheduled for December.
Oh, that was an exciting time. Understatement. This was what the team, and there was still a core team there that had been there, from day one. This is what we were shooting for. This was our ultimate goal, was to go public, and not many companies succeeded at this, and and we did. So it was super exciting. Everyone within the company owned and had some Citrix stock, so everyone benefited. That was part of your pay package, was to get stock options, even back in those days, early on. And so everyone felt this in their pocket when the company went public, and the fact that it was so successful, because it went out at 15 and closed that same day at 30, so it doubled in that first day, and that that wasn't that common.
No, not at all. And you guys did it in 5 years.
Yep. Now, in those 5 years, I never mentioned, but the company almost, went under a couple times in that time frame. It was close. In particular, the before we shipped the very first product, multi-user, when IBM and Microsoft split, at that point there was talk about the investors, are they going to give up on the company? Because there was no income or revenue at that point, and the likelihood of it succeeding at that point was very small. So, but luckily, and that was part of the Citrix upper management at that point, was the strength and connections they had. They were able, and the investors believing in those people, in the people who founded the company, that they put in more money, and were able to make it to this point of actually going public. And the return on investment, from what I've heard, was very good for those initial investors of the
Oh
company.
yeah, and by the way, they are investors, so they know that some of their investments work, some don't.
Yeah.
And they don't have a crystal ball. And every company that's been successful can look back at 2 or 3 times just like this, where they almost went under and they were saved by the skin of their teeth. So 95 is interesting because the IPO happens.
Yep.
WinFrame comes out right after that in February. And then, you guys just got done, sort of convincing these guys to keep the investment money going. Then you get an IPO, but then you get to 97, and then, oh no, you got this Microsoft thing.
Yeah.
Tell us about that turmoil.
At this point, after the public offering, Citrix was revenue positive, so we were profitable at this point. In fact, traditionally, in the 90s like this, companies didn't go public unless they were revenue positive and they were making money. That's not so much the case nowadays, but back then it was. So the revenue was there. We were doing good, and we were working. We were on NT3. WinFrame 1.6 had moved to NT351, and engineering was working, in the 96 time frame, was working on the next version based on NT4.0. Okay, so we had the source, every time Microsoft made a release, we had to sync all those source changes into our product. So we had this, which was an interesting process, by the way, but we had this 3-way sync. You had the original source drop that we got from Microsoft, we got the new source code that we got from Microsoft, and we had our current product. And they were all different. And we had a tool that could run a 3-way sync and basically figure out what changes we had made to the original code that needed to go into the new code that we got from Microsoft. And
Wow,
then you had
did a source code diff.
Yeah, and it was a 3-way, which was kind of unusual. And then we had to manually go through, and we could basically say, nope, yes, yes, nope, got to rewrite that, yes, no, got to redo that, got to come back to that, and because collisions, we made changes, Microsoft made changes to the same file, and they collide, and so you got to manually reconcile that. So it was non-trivial when these updates came from Microsoft. And was WinFrame 1.6 was one of those updates. And now we were working on WinFrame 2.0 was the code under the covers. And we never shipped 2.0, by the way. But it was based on NT4.0. And then at this time frame, we were well underway. We had a beta. At this point, Microsoft announced that they were not going to renew our license, Citrix's, because remember, we had a license for NT that allowed us to make derivative works and reship it. And they basically said, Citrix can no longer do that, starting with NT4.0. And we did not have a license to ship NT4.0. We've been working on it for about a year, but we didn't have a license to ship it. And Microsoft announced this to the world through a press release. And at the same time, they announced that they had acquired multi-user technology from another company, not Citrix, but another company called Prolog. It was a French-based company. And they were a minor competitor of Citrix, Prolog was. And that Microsoft was going to create their own version of multi-user based on that code. and Citrix was hung up, left to die basically at this point. So this was disaster, of course, and the stock cratered because we were a public company at the time. It cratered. We had to have a press announcement saying that yes, basically acknowledging this was happening. Ed Akabuchi, among others, a small team basically rented apartments outside of Microsoft in Redmond, Seattle, the Washington area, and went there, camped out, and started pitching Microsoft that they need to do this with Citrix. We have a bunch of patents on how we did this multi-user, so we got IP protection, from a legal standpoint. And I got involved also, and Citrix's whole pitch was, okay, we've done this, we know how to do this multi-user stuff, we have a successful product in the market, and we have this IP that protects what we did, and we decided to be open about how we did this, and so we pitched, and this is where I was involved, basically presented to Microsoft, their engineering team, and I believe Cutler was in a few of these meetings, Dave Cutler, but to their NT team, how we made NT multi-user. So we presented we just opened up. There was nothing to lose at this point. It was all or nothing. And over several months, this took a while, and we did these presentations and negotiation back and forth. Ultimately, Microsoft agreed that they liked what we did, and in the end, we licensed all the changes we did to NT, all the source code changes we made back to Microsoft. Now this was tricky because how do you do all this and still keep a business? Because Citrix, we couldn't just sell everything back to Microsoft and then we wouldn't have anything. Citrix wouldn't have anything. So what was decided, and this is why this took a long time, because there was a lot of back and forth negotiations. So in the end, what we ended up doing, we licensed the core multi-user changes back to Microsoft. So everything that made the kernel and NT itself multi-user, Microsoft got back. We created a clean split, and actually I created a bunch of APIs that would allow Citrix to build a product on top of that. And so this was the beginning of Windows NT terminal services. So that's what Microsoft owned, was WinT terminal services. And then a core thing, or a key, and I credit this is why Citrix succeeded, we kept the ICA protocol. So Citrix kept ICA. Now, Microsoft knew they needed a protocol, but in the end, they agreed that Citrix should keep the protocol. And we had some early farm management. So we had ICA browser, we had admin tools. We had ways to make a cluster of servers into a farm. And that was core technology and Citrix kept that. So basically Microsoft got everything to make NT into a single, multi-user box. But Citrix kept the remoting protocol and all the management and the farm aspect. In other words, how do you create a large, deployment of, maybe 10 servers that can be managed as one? And how do you load balance between those, 10 servers? How do you manage the users, keep track of who's logged in and all the utilities and tools? So Citrix kept that. And then we created APIs that allowed us to add all that functionality back on top of terminal server. And then Microsoft had to go off and they licensed technology to create the RDP protocol. And that was because they needed, something out of the box. And that was the first version of RDP.
So that's great because you guys licensed enough of the code in the kernel to be packed into NT. So you didn't have to ship the OS anymore.
That's correct. That was the absolute goal was at that point, and that was Microsoft's goal, because they did not like another company shipping NT. That was ultimately why they cut our agreement, because they wanted to take 100% control. And in the end, it was not an easy job for Citrix to support the NT kernel, for our customers. So from a customer standpoint, it was probably better. The solution probably got a little more expensive because now, Microsoft got its license and Citrix got its license, the add-on, and it wasn't quite as clean because it was now an add-on. The Citrix product was installed on top of terminal services instead of just a single product, so it complicated things in that way. But in the end, no surprise, it wasn't sustainable to keep, for Citrix to continue to ship NT, a whole, copy of Windows going forward.
Yeah, it makes tons of sense. You got that code back in there so they could ship the OS, but when the OS was installed at a customer's site, you knew Citrix could drop in on top of it and
Yep.
work. And with that, they thought, well, hey, we'll do terminal services and find some RDP software, so we'll have sort of an offering here, but it never was an enterprise offering, nor was there a focus on it at the time. And that's why you pulled, the ICA protocol and the farm technology and just all the other management tools and so forth, and then added so much to that to stay relevant. Did the market understand that at that point?
Once we announced that we'd come to this agreement, the stock recovered pretty darn quick. So there was, based on that, there was some, level of understanding. Now there was, from that day forward, there was always, how long can Citrix last? When will Microsoft catch up and replace, have everything, out of the, in the product, the core product will do everything that Citrix does. So that became a challenge going forward, from 97 to today. It's no different, to keep ahead, make sure you have enough value there that customers are willing to pay for it.
The 10 years that I was there, it was a swinging pendulum of Citrix is going to die, or Microsoft is going to acquire Citrix now. Wait a minute, no, Citrix, it's like back and forth. And so, yes, it was always that stay in front of them, stay ahead of them game. And it was an on-prem game because this is before cloud really took off. So it was, at least the playground was confined, to the data center. It's beyond that now. So you survived 97, and then you got the release later on of WinFrame 1.7. Now this is still on 3.5.1.
Yep, WinFrame, that was, I believe, the last, complete, where we actually shipped NT. And that was about that same time frame. We had a lot, what happened with 1.7, we were working towards a WinFrame 2.0. And obviously that got delayed when this whole thing happened. And then terminal server had to get created, and Microsoft had to create that, product in order to be able to ship the next version, of, ultimately MetaFrame was the first product that layered on top of terminal server. But we had all this new technology and product, that we've been working on for many years in WinFrame 2.0. So we decided let's take that out of the 4.0 NT 4.0 base and put it into 3.5.1, and that was WinFrame 1.7. So we basically took a lot of the technology that we've been working on and shipped it here. There was actually, it's not really clear, this ICA ALE. This was an industry first. Basically allowed you to embed Windows apps within web apps. So you could have within a browser, you could have a window that was basically the ICA client, and that would automatically connect. So when you navigated to that page, that web page, it would open up a Windows app in the background through that web page, and that was done in this time frame. That was done through ActiveX.
Back in the early days of ActiveX, I remember that. That was so promising that it's like, wait a minute, what? You can do this? Yeah. Hey, by the way, do you have any of the insight into the naming WinView, WinFrame, MetaFrame? Was that all marketing, or did they collaborate with you?
No, engineering was never involved with names.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, hey, let's take a look at a little photos along the way. The Citrix Test Lab back in '97.
It's interesting. Again, all these CRTs in there, all the terminals. Most of those are terminals. They're not monitors. They're terminals. Majority of them are. And then the computers down, on the bottom, on the lower level. But this was, the test department, because we had, in this time frame, this was still WinFrame. So there was a lot of testing to be done because we were building all of NT. So we had to test a lot. And that's what was happening here.
Well, the raised floors look the same and the chairs look the same, 20 years ago. Certainly the monitors are very different and the racks and so forth. A lot of cables for sure.
Yeah.
And hey, this is cool here in '98. You got the SC group out, and now I see Mark T across the table from you. So now he's there with the group. Yep. You recognize some of the boys here?
Yeah, we worked with, got together with the SC group on a fairly regular basis. Because they were really our ears, to the customer. They were in there, working with the customers firsthand, and so it was always, I found it always very valuable to get firsthand feedback from these folks to help drive the the product and what's working, what's not, what features are missing. We couldn't do everything that they asked, but it was very, very valuable to help prioritize.
Yeah, I'm sure these guys had tons of questions for you, and these meetings, that the time they spent with you was translated out to the customer. So that's cool. And then this looks like one of the first Citrix events here called Thynergy.
Yeah, this may have been the first one, because Citrix had these industry events, and the first ones we had were Thynergy, and they were strongly focused on ICA, because after this Microsoft agreement, this is what we had. The company, we had ICA, and we had some management stuff, but ICA was what really distinguished, or the technology that we had within the company.
Well, it even allowed you to spend more time in engineering focus on ICA and make it even better and differentiate even more. So that particular focus actually really, really helped Citrix. Now,
Yeah.
I know a bunch of the folks that are going to be watching this video are going to talk about, I was into Citrix on WinView 1 point this, and I came in WinFrame 2.1 or 1 point that. And they'll talk about the ones that were actually at this event, because there will be, the tail of the culture is so long and so deep. So, and, another shot from that event right here is you talking on the panel here at this event.
Yep. Yeah, we had presentations on different topics, and there was definitely presentations on ICA and the technologies around the product.
Looks like you got a lot of demo equipment out front too.
Yeah. I don't think that was even used for this talk. But yeah, this is all engineering. This is all engineering folks.
And then you guys jumped on a plane and went out to Japan.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Just from a personal experience, for one thing, it was the first time I'd been to. In Citrix, I made 2 trips to Tokyo, Japan, and this was one of them. And they were both focused on ICA. They were basically ICA conferences where we were demoing. And this was a device that had ICA built into it. And the Japanese folks, obviously they excelled at all these different devices, and getting them to adopt ICA was the goal here.
So it looks like you're handing them a stylus.
Yeah, the more devices we had that supported ICA, that would drive sales of the server products.
And the Citrix client had to support touch here now with the stylus.
Yeah. No, I think it did mouse emulation was what was happening here, because we never directly created stylus code within the ICA protocol. So it was mouse emulation.
Well, then we pop into the new world of the MetaFrame days.
Yep. Yeah, the more modern approach where customer would purchase, NT, in this case, terminal server from Microsoft, and then the product, MetaFrame from Citrix, and then add that on top. And that's what this MetaFrame 1.0 was, the first product that supported that split. Now we started focusing more and more on the server farm concept, and which was a way to distinguish or differentiate Citrix from the core Microsoft offering. We were going after larger and larger companies, larger and larger deployments, and supporting load balancing management across for hundreds of users instead of what a single server could support.
A lot of folks watching this are going to remember the MetaFrame days for sure. And so I came in after that myself. And by the way, I came in right here in 2004. So it looks like you got your annual regular architect meeting, and this time in the UK.
Yeah, as the company grew, we actually created an architect group within Citrix that I headed up. And this group, the way it was structured was that there was architects that were focused on different technologies within the company. So it kind of split across, the different groups. So the different engineering groups, had the developers that did the coding and the development, and then the architects would work with those teams to help drive the vision and the direction and the technology. So they were really responsible. And then this team came together to share that vision, and I worked with the team. And so this was a way that we could kind of share, merge and make sure we were all working towards a common goal and common vision from a technology standpoint, and then push that and coordinate that throughout the rest of the company, the engineering teams.
And this is when I joined, and I remember I was there from 2004 to 14, and I remember Citrix being $500 million company to about a $3 billion company over
Yeah.
those 10. So we're at about 500 million right here. And I also remember, I was part of Net6, the first appliance that was brought in, and then NetScaler came later, and Orbital Data,
Yeah.
Branch Repeater, and all that. And so Citrix was kind of a one-trick pony back then, and that was the thing. You need to broaden and do additional acquisitions, grab adjacent products, and so forth. But this is also the era where Presentation Server now, the new name, comes in.
Yeah. The big difference in some of these products and the reasons the names changed. I mean, MetaFrame, actually before Presentation Server, I just backtracking a little bit, was where we introduced IMA. Independent management architecture, and this was key to Citrix, was because IMA was the infrastructure, or that was used to build farms, to build large farms that could scale and that could load balance and that you could be manageable. And IMA ended up being more critical technology within the Citrix. Another reason Citrix existed before IMA was the ICA browser, and that was more something I hacked together in the early days that was used for way too long, is my opinion, for multiple years, that used IPX and datagram based stuff, and that got ultimately replaced by IMA. Was much more mature and was a database. There was a database involved with IMA that was used to persist all the configuration, and that eventually evolved into this FMA, which was, you can see here in the Zen products. So before MetaFrame, it was ICA browser, and then MetaFrame was IMA, and then the Zen products was FluxCast. So when we made these key technology transitions, because we're morphing to each of these, and that was non-trivial. The marketing would change the name of the products because it was a good time to change the name, I guess, because the underlying technology was changing. But it's this management infrastructure along with the ICA protocol that was really why Citrix succeeded, in my opinion.
I think there's a lot of people that went through the IMA FMA transition, right?
Yeah.
And so good thing this is a YouTube video with a comments section down below. You guys should jump in the comments. Tell us what happened to you during the IMA FMA transition, and hopefully we won't have a lot of exclamation marks down there.
Yeah, I think uh, it was not as clean as it should have been, that transition.
Yeah.
And it took way too long. Uh, the transition to IMA was hard enough, but I think that went smoother than the transition to FMA from IMA. I think that was rough. And it's just because it was done a little bit too piecemeal, and features weren't there, and it was just not easy.
You got to reinvent yourself sometimes.
That's the trouble with technology. You can't just, sit on, the same technology for forever and ever, because there's always something new coming out. And if you don't keep ahead and keep pushing forward, you're going to be left behind. And someone new and nimble will overtake you.
And by the way, the last part on the naming here, once the Zen acquisition happened, where we brought in Zen Server, then marketing goes, we can use a Zen prefix everywhere now. So
Yeah.
Zen apps, Zen desktop, Zen client, Zen mobile, it's just bing, bang, boom.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, you know what? This turned out well. Here we got a photo of Bill Burley giving you the Abacus Award in 2009. You remember this one?
I'm trying to remember. I think this was what was it, a 20-year? Yeah, that was 20 years, 2009, 89 to 2009. That was a 20-year anniversary award.
So no gold watch, huh? Just a little statue?
Yeah, I don't remember getting a watch.
Well, that was cool. Now, hey, here's another one. So since I wandered onto the scene here, then there was, two Brad Petersons in the company. It was like, what? So I know you and I used to get each other's email every once in a while,
yeah.
and we go, this one must be for you, and that one must be for you. It was probably pretty obvious because, you were the architect for 20 years and had those discussions. And once I came back from Europe, as I lived out there for 2 years with Citrix and launched the appliance products, I ended up joining Mark on stage quite a bit for the events that we did, the Synergy events and so on. And so you were creating the product, and Mark and I were on stage making people love the product and the community and the company and so on and so on. But, you weren't just behind the desk. You also got out there on stage as well. You remember this panel?
Oh, yeah. No, we did this, multiple times over the years. But, technology basically is just a Q&A type panel. But, open-ended questions on technology.
Yeah, I like this because, the questions come from the audience a lot of times. Maybe they'll come from Harry Labano over on the left here if he's sort of moderating.
Yep.
You guys jump in and you handle it. It's kind of casual and kind of, everyone's having a good time. But there's other panels that you were on that were more intense. I think they took your entire attention here, because you might be a competitive guy too. I'm not sure.
Yeah, this looks like we were driving something.
Yeah, I think so.
Hopefully,
that was a fun
nothing
panel.
too critical at this point.
No, blowing off some steam.
Yep.
And then, speaking of 2014, as I transitioned out of Citrix into DocuSign, you had the architects out in our wonderful Santa Clara location.
Yeah. This was actually about 10 years after that other picture that you showed. And just, how significantly the company grew. And this was mainly through acquisitions and different, the different California offices. But all the different offices here are represented. The UK office, the Sydney, Australia office, Santa Clara, Santa Barbara. It was quite a collection of people.
Yeah, definitely. And this, to me, was kind of the heyday. It was kind of the height of Citrix. It's like I said, from 2004 to 14, it went from 500 million to 3 billion. And this was kind of the pinnacle here. Some of the greatest times in those 10 years for me. I got lucky. Those were great years. But for you, it was 30 years. And so, I've got this section that I normally do inside of the podcast interviews, and it is called the speed round, right? And so it's for folks to get to know you. So it's some quick questions that you haven't seen before.
No.
And basically, I just pop them on you, and you just give me that answer without even thinking. It just pops right out of you, And so it's like, who is the real Brad Peterson? We get to know you better. Now, normally I ask you the question, but about a week and a half ago, I was at the iGel Now and Next event, and there were so many old friends of yours. I had recorded them asking you the question. So, you ready for this?
Yeah, let's go.
All right.
Don't know what to expect here.
Here goes question number one.
All right. Hey, Brad, this is Vicky Palmerico. What is one piece of technology from the 90s that you still secretly love?
So the question is, what one technology from the 90s? Well, the obvious one is the internet. I mean, that's definitely the 90s. It's TCP, IP was at its core, but the internet, it was, the beginning of the internet. Before this time, we had bookshelves full of technology books, programming books, of coding books, of the OS2 books, of NT books, of DOS books, you name it. It's just one after another, and that was all you had. If you had a question, you went to those books. But after the internet, just night and day. Especially after Google existed.
Good point. I thought you might have said your Apple Newton or your Palm Pilot or something. No.
No.
All right. Good answer. I wouldn't even have thought of that. That's obviously the answer that everybody benefits from. So let's go to number two.
Brad, who's your favorite Citrix customer?
So favorite Citrix customer. I don't have any one. That would be picking favorites. I personally, I work much closer with partners than customers.
Okay. Well, I thought maybe you would be like politically correct on this one. So I picked one for you. Are you ready for this?
Go for
You remember him?
Another Brad.
Did you ever? I don't know if you ever met him. I would see him at Synergy and various trade shows. It was so funny seeing him.
No, I don't recall meeting him. I may have, because I met a lot of folks over the years, but my memory's not as good as it should be.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he was the CIO for NASDAQ for so long. I thought maybe that one's your favorite customer. It's one of mine for sure. All right, number three.
Hey Brad, it's Joel Stocker. I'm not sure if you remember, but back in the early 2000s, I was a sales engineer in Europe for Citrix, and you and a bunch of your friends came over to talk to us about the ICA protocol for one of the SurfTech events. And one thing that I clearly remember was, when we asked you a question about how certain things work, you would really look up in your head and you would kind of like go through the code and kind of like figure out, is it possible? What is the answer to this question? And you would just answer. And it was, left such an impression on me and the other SEs. So my question is, can you still remember all the source code? And if I ask you a question about ICA, will you be able to kind of like answer it like that?
Well, my answer with ICA would be dated. Be at least 10 years dated, since I really haven't kept up in the last 10 years what's happened to ICA, and it hasn't stayed still. I know it continues to change, but I remember pretty good how ICA works and all the at least 10 years and prior back.
You remember back then when you were working with these guys, like you're at the SE dinners and you're on the panel, and it's like, you're writing the software all day long and it's really running up in there. And that's like, it's kind of how you can do QA and you can debug stuff, because not because you looked it up as much, but because it ran in your head and you go, oh, well, that would end up here and go over there. And so those were the days, right? Now, I know the ICA protocols might be 10 years old, but you're working on your own software projects. That software must be running in your head now, huh?
Oh, definitely. What's kind of interesting is, since retiring, one of my hobbies is coding, in particular with C#. I love the C# programming language. I think it's very powerful, and so I've taken that on and had written a bunch of different projects in the last 10 years. And I've actually coded probably more in the last 10 years than I did at the last 10 years of Citrix, because the last 10 years of Citrix, I was more focused on technology and architecture and technology direction and not so much coding. And I've always loved coding, and so retiring has allowed me to get back into that to some degree. But yeah, when I'm working on a problem, it's all you can think about. If you hit a roadblock. But what I find best nowadays, is if I hit one of those roadblocks, I just go outside, go for a walk, and in the woods, and typically you just relax and you walk and you kind of let your mind go, and the solution will come to you. At least it comes to me. And if that doesn't work, I sleep on it, and overnight, and the solution comes to me. So yes, your mind really can work through those problems and come up with solutions without you, consciously working the problem. It's more, indirect. It's more subconscious.
In fact, if you consciously focus on it too much, you won't find the answer.
Yeah.
You have to let it go and be free.
Because you go down, dead ends basically. But if you just let your subconscious work on it, it works wonders.
And by the way, I threw this little extra morsel in there for those watching terminal server command line utilities. These are ones that you used quite a bit back in the day.
Yeah. What's interesting about these is that they're still in Windows. So when you buy Windows today from Microsoft, these commands exist, even though it's a single user system. I wrote all these commands and the underlying APIs, and at Citrix, and they actually have their history in OS2. The syntax of these were in the early, go back to multi-user, believe it or not. So the original syntax of these commands go back to the very first product Citrix created, and that was brought forward. Now, obviously, the underlying code has been rewritten a few times, but it's kind of interesting history. Is that these are just some core, ideas in the product, the architecture of the product. You have processes, you have sessions, you have terminal servers, multiple servers, you have a login, and these concepts still exist in today's products.
The code underneath changes depending on what OS or what version, but the calls and the function and the purpose seems to still be the same.
Yep.
Well, we've got number 4 here.
Hey Brad, this is Frank Anderson, if you remember me back in the day. Old Citrite, of course, not quite as old as single-digit Citrite, but nonetheless. So I have a quick question for you that I think would be very interesting and fascinating. Of course, the history of Citrix. So doing the change when Windows NT 3.5.1 was licensed with Citrix, and that was switched over, then that's right when they had this little bit of licensing back and forth going on with Windows Terminal Server and Microsoft. If there's some sort of story there behind the covers that we don't know about, when yourself and Ed, Brian Nason, all of these guys, Terry Trader, if there's something that happened in that story that we, or unaware of, something that would be really interesting to tell us about. So that's my question. Thank you.
I think we covered that in great detail.
Yep. It's definitely a story.
Yeah. And so I think you packaged that one up nice. So Frank and everybody is going to be really happy to hear that. So let's go to number 5.
Hey Brad, this is a difficult one. Marcel here. How many times did switching to the RDP protocol instead of using the in-house ICA or EdgeDX came up in discussions? And do you think it would have been better for Citrix?
The core question is this: should Citrix abandon ICA and use RDP instead? And so it only became relevant, obviously, since RDP existed. And there were people who thought that was... Our dogs are going crazy. I
think they're protesting against this. They say, no way, keep ICA. I heard you.
Yeah,
I told you.
the question was asked a lot. I was of the opinion that ICA was where Citrix got a lot of its value and continued to get a lot of its value, and that if we were to switch and try to build upon RDP, RDP was not open enough. In other words, RDP is fairly closed, and so Microsoft obviously can build upon RDP, but it would have been difficult for Citrix to add a lot of value in RDP in the same way that we get value out of ICA. So in the end, it was decided that it's better to continue investing in ICA, just because we own the technology, we can take it where we want, and we have full freedom and flexibility. Whereas if we tried to use RDP, our hands would be tied too much, and over time, it would be too difficult to add value that customers would be willing to pay money for.
And you had to, like we said earlier, make sure that the Citrix value was clear, not only for the stock, but for the customers as well. And so the value that was added on top of ICA and then HDX was amazing. And by the way, I kind of thought this would be an interesting point to drop in the acquisitions that happened over time. Maybe you can reflect on sort of this list in order.
The Citrix acquisitions, there's a lot of history here. And this kind of summarizes, the acquisitions that Citrix did up until 2007. The very first acquisition that was DataPack, and it's about as far away as possible. It was Sydney, Australia, but that was on purpose. Citrix. The primary reason that was done initially was to get in, as a kind of a bridge into the Asian Pacific market, and to get some, sales and people representing Citrix in those markets. We did happen to get a very good engineering team. It was a small group, headed up by Martin Dersma, that added a lot of value, in particular around the ICA protocol over the years, and they had a lot of innovation out of that group. But they were more of a research group, and they were researching technology, and then that ultimately got integrated into the products, and a lot of focus on ICA. So that was 97. The next acquisition was Insignia, and that was in UK or in England, High Wycombe, England. And that was led by Keith Turnbull, another great guy. And they had, the reason for that acquisition, they had Unix versions of the product, and they had a Mac ICA client, which up to that point, Citrix did not support Macintosh for ICA clients. And they had ICA clients for Unix, all the different Unix platforms. So that was their initial focus in the early, the very early days. So that was pretty critical. Then the next one was really focused on Java. Java was starting to get presence in the market, and Citrix really had little to zero experience with Java. Java being a language, but it was used in the web, with web browsers and so forth. JavaScript being a flavor of that, and that was in Cambridge, England, very close to the the Insignia or the High Wycombe office, and that was really focused. And over the years, they did a lot of work on web interface and the web front end to the Citrix products, web interface in particular. Then Citrix were looking to this web thing. That was another. There was a lot of ongoing concerns. One of those concerns was Microsoft with RDP was going to take over. Microsoft was going to acquire Citrix. Microsoft was going to take over, and Citrix would no longer be relevant. The other was that web technology was going to take over, because Citrix was all about running Windows apps. And the thought was that Windows apps aren't, a year from now or 2 years from now, Windows apps are not going to be relevant. Everything's going to be web. Everything's going to be Java. I mean, that was APM.
And here we are 25 years later.
Yeah. The reality is very different. It takes a long time for these technology transitions to actually occur, especially in Fortune 500 large enterprises. They're slow to change, and these technologies are slow to change. But ViewSoft was an acquisition, to try to bet on, acquire some technology that was for web-based applications. It never really went anywhere, but that was the idea, was that this, is to be relevant in this web-based world. Sequoia is more web at this point in the early 2000s, portals, again, web technology, websites, but focused on enterprise portals was the big new thing, that these portals were going to take over. So all these apps that you used to use to run your business, you just do everything in a portal, web-based portal. And that was the next, thing that was going to change the world. And that was the Sequoia acquisition. Now that one, in hindsight, was probably a mistake. It never went anywhere. We integrated some of that technology, but most of it was never used. The next acquisition you see there is Expert City. That was actually branching into a new market. It's totally something new. And they had, in particular, they had GoToMyPC, GoToAssist, and GoToMeeting. I think GoToMeeting came out slightly after this acquisition, but they were very successful in that space. And there was a separate company within Citrix, or separate entity within Citrix, that kind of ran its own P&L, and they had their own. Everything was independent, separate from the the core or the prior Citrix products, and they did quite well. Now that, my understanding, that's all been spun off and sold since I left. But those products, very interesting. Then comes your company, Net6, and that was, again, this internet thing taking off. Security. We needed a good security story. SSL VPNs were taking off. I mean, you could tell this story much better than I can, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, it was an SSL VPN appliance that we had created.
Yep.
We were very successful. We're right in San Jose, California. So as you guys were kind of opening the offices in that area, we had some proximity there. But, remote access, the access button was the big thing back then. And how are you going to do that? IPsec VPN was problematic, dropping connections all the time. SSL was like a miracle compared to that. And so we were interesting. Now, the acquisition of Net6, though, was a painful process, because you guys had in the past maybe not done enough due diligence on a couple of acquisitions, and it didn't see a lot of returns. So the due diligence was cranked up to 11 when you guys acquired us. So thank you very much. But you found a good story, good people, good products, and then we came in. And it was wonderful. I launched it all over the East, through Australia, New Zealand, and just everywhere in China and Japan and so on. And then I took it and launched it in Europe, all over the place. And I was offered a position on either place, and I chose Switzerland and worked with those guys for 2 years, 2005, 6, and 7. And it couldn't have been better. And those were the years also, 6 months later, that NetScaler came in. And then, the others here, along with Orbital Data. So we had, the hardware had come into the product line now. So it wasn't really a one-trick pony anymore. It was quite a big offering, even along with Expert City, which is GoTo, and GoToWebinar had been added on at that point as well. So those were super, interesting times from my perspective. It'd be interesting to hear how that was viewed from, sort of Florida engineering.
Yeah, no, it was all about, being where the apps were. And if the apps were going to be web-based, or the, internet, remote access, you didn't need, a presentation server or a Zen app type product necessarily. if the apps that you cared about were all 100% web-based. So it was about being relevant in app delivery, but web-based, the web-based world. So that's really kind of what drove these different acquisitions, was making sure that we could fulfill the need for more than just Windows applications, but we could also provide value around web applications.
Right, and then then the whole Zen source, that was an interesting one because clearly that changed the product names everywhere. And Zen Server, it had sort of an opportunity to be a real contender out there. So maybe you can share, your thoughts on that.
I mean, that was all in the time frame where instead of building out your server farms with individual servers, the hardware was getting more and more powerful. The computers, the PC hardware was getting more and more powerful. You could build larger and larger servers. So it started making sense. So instead of buying 10 computers, you'd buy one computer and then run a hypervisor, and you'd run virtual servers. And it just was more cost effective and cheaper to manage. So that's kind of what drove the Zen acquisition, was to have a more comprehensive product in this space. We supported VMware with their hypervisors, but this was about having a Citrix-based product that didn't require VMware. So it was about controlling more of the stack and having a more comprehensive solution. And in this time frame, the the virtual desktop started becoming more and more important also. So instead of running a Zen app where you kind of have a virtual desktop, why not run a complete Windows within a VM and run many of those? And 10 years, 20 years prior, that didn't make any sense because the hardware was too small, not enough memory, not enough horsepower. But now that the computers were getting so powerful, it starting to make a lot of sense, where you could actually run a hypervisor with multiple copies of Windows, each of those connected to an end user. And this is kind of what drove the push into the cloud too, into cloud-based services, because now instead of hosting all this yourself, you could start pushing this out into the cloud, out in the internet, and in different, and have, whether you host it yourself in the cloud or whether you paid someone to do it, there's starting to become a lot of options.
And then Arden's coming in as the provisioning capability.
Yeah. To be able to manage and provision those servers and the apps on those servers, and it was all around. That was all around management. How can we make this, easier to manage, cheaper to manage, and have visibility into that management.
All right. Well, that was a trip down memory lane for acquisitions because there were so many. It's like one trick pony. No, not anymore. And let's go back into a couple of questions here, okay? We've got an old buddy of yours here.
Yeah.
Hey, Brad. This is Alex Rubio. I don't know if you remember me. I started in 1998 as a test engineer. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the monkey ceremony we used to have and where that came from.
Yeah, for folks that don't know what the monkey ceremony is,
which would be everybody except for you.
Yeah, that was a tradition, and it had to do with shipping. When Citrix shipped a product, we always had a monkey ceremony, and it dates back actually to multi-user. So way back, almost to the first. I don't know if it was the first multi-user or the second multi-user, but Citrix had a customer, I think it was the first multi-user, is a very early customer that ran multi-user. It's called Bombay. It was a store, it was a retail outlet, and believe it or not. And they ran multi-user, and one of our engineers did an on-site visit to debug a problem or help them with they were having some problems with the product. And after he resolved that problem, Uh, the man, the manager there at Bombay gave, and it was Ed Janesis, was the Citrix engineer, gave him this brass monkey. It stands about maybe 8 inches, 6 inches high, and it has a little 3x3 table or a tabletop, so you can put stuff on it, like your keys or something. And it's meant just, to sit on a table or something in your house. And it's made out of brass. And for whatever reason, when we shipped this first product, the Bombay company was the first early successful company using the product. We brought this back and put this monkey on the table, and then laid all the floppy disks that made up the product on top of it. And then all the engineers, we walk by and look at the monkey and stare at its eyes. And the idea was if the monkey didn't blink, it was good luck. Of course, it wasn't a blink; it was made out of brass. But this was done for this first product release, multi-user, and the product was relatively successful. And for whatever caught on as a tradition, and I think it's been done ever since on every Citrix product release out of Fort Lauderdale. And some of the other sites we got some duplicate monkeys over the years, and some of the others, the UK sites in particular, had their version of their own copy of the monkey. And that's what this monkey ceremony was basically. It was part of the ship process that, because we always got all the engineers, every time we shipped, we got all the engineers together, had a party, some drinks and stuff, and celebrated the fact that we were shipping this next version of the product. And that was part of that ceremony, was the monkey ceremony.
So it sounds like a superstition kind of.
Yeah, it's one of those things that got started, and no one dared stop it, I guess.
Yeah, if it's working, don't fix it if it ain't broke.
Oh.
So that is something probably nobody but the engineers know about. Thanks for sharing that. And when you say it's still going, you mean it was going in 2014?
It was going when I left. When I retired, it was still going.
All right. Well, we'll have to check in with those boys and see what's going on. All right. Hey, number 7. You know this guy.
Oh, yeah.
Brad, it's Barry Flanagan. Hope you're doing well. My question for you is, you obviously own the patent, you developed ICA. If you could go back in time and do it again, what would you do differently?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question. If you can do it again. We actually did do it again. So the current ICAs, at least when I left, ICA 3.0 was its nomenclature. So we had an ICA 1.0, and we threw that away, and we did ICA 2, and that was in ICA 2 was part of the OS2 based product. We threw that away, and I got to do it a third time, and I did it a third time for NT. So we actually did it 3 times, and we learned each time we did that, and I hope. The idea was that we improved upon it each time we did that redone. So there is that kind of in the background. It is kind of the way it is. It's a bit overly complex, and part of that was when ICA 3.0 was actually created, we actually had to support IPX, SPX, NetBEUI, Serial, TCP. I think we actually had a UDP. Protocols. These are all underlying transport protocols, and we had to be able to configure and support every one of those. And then some of these are datagram based. Some of them are session reliable already. The ones that are datagram based are not reliable, so we had to add a reliable layer, and then we had to add an encryption layer. So it got very complex to be able to support all these different transports. Now, if you were to do it again today, you would just do TCP, and that's it. there's no reason to support all these other protocols, and that would simplify things. But we're still living with the framework that supports all these, and the protocol is at its lowest level can negotiate in all these different complex stacks. And that's not necessary anymore.
Well, good question, Barry. Yes, it has been redesigned. And it sounds like if you, like you said, if you were to redesign it, you would just redo the whole thing.
There's some simplification. Yep. And nowadays, just SSL, why use anything else? We had our own encryption that was part of the stack that we had to maintain and manage. We used industry encryption. Initially we used RSA, which isn't really around nowadays either. So technology moves on, and so there's a lot of old stuff you no longer have to support, and also you understand the requirements better after living with something for 10, 20 years. The requirements become much clearer. What's important, what's not important, what you need to support, what you could throw away. But when you initially do something, you don't know. So you have to cover your bases, and often you create stuff that never gets used or rarely gets used. And so that's the other advantage of time, is that the requirements get crystallized.
Very good. Hey, number 8. You remember this guy?
All right. Hey, Brad. Adam Lotz here. So I joined Citrix back in 2000. I was employee number 1400, so a little bit after you got there. 2 questions. What was it like being in a technology company in Florida back then? And then I heard there was a hot tub in headquarters back in the day. Do you have any good stories about that?
There actually was a hot tub. Not that engineering ever used it. It was up in the executive area. The building that we leased, I think we leased it, had a hot tub in it. I'm not sure you'd want to use it. I saw it a few times, but I don't think it was actually used ever.
Oh, okay. And was it difficult or strange having a tech company in Florida? Did you just want to go to the beach all the time?
We were far enough from the beach. At least that wasn't it wasn't like you were looking out your window and you saw the beach. So there was that. What was difficult was there weren't that many technology companies in South Florida. IBM being one of the few, and even IBM, eventually they moved most of their engineers out of Florida. So they used to have a lot of engineers, in Boca, but that was really downsized significantly. So Citrix was one of the largest, technology companies in Florida. Where that made a difference was the hiring. There weren't not much local talent, and it was what Citrix. What we found was that, at least in the early days, we really couldn't hire experienced people. No one in California wanted to move to Florida. Okay, so that wasn't going to happen. And so what we ended up doing for many, many, many years was college interviewing. And we'd hire out of the Midwest, Big Ten schools. And it was a lot of effort to filter through, and find, the stars. But we we had a great interviewing process in the early days. It was very grueling. But the result was that we hired very good engineers. And coming out of college, Florida sounds very interesting. So they think beach and warm weather and warm winters. I mean, that's why I went to Florida because I grew up in Minnesota, went to school at University of Minnesota, and got hired out of there to Florida, and that we were successful with. And that's how Citrix grew its engineering initially, was a very robust college recruiting.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you found going from Minnesota to Florida was a big plus, and so you figured the rest of those kids would. And as you guys did acquisitions, in all the various parts of the world, there was an engineering, nucleus in California, in Australia, in the UK, and so forth. So that allowed it to be amazing, and yet the core was still there in Florida. Now, number 9, you probably remember this crazy cat.
Hey Brad, you might remember me. My name is Doug Brown from old Citrix, and it's first of all very nice to say hello. It's very nice to ask you a question. I asked you this question many years ago, and you might not remember it, but as many people might know, Paul McCartney went to sleep one night, dreamed up yesterday, woke up and composed it. I heard the rumor that you had went to sleep one night, dreamed load balancing for early Citrix MetaFrame, woke up and coded it. Is this true, and can you share that story?
So what Doug is referring to is the early load balancing, which was what we called the ICA browser. And I probably did dream it because that's how I came up with a lot of my ideas, as we were talking earlier. So we had. It was a piece of technology that I created was the ICA browser, and it was a way to discover what servers existed. So a client could use it to discover servers, all in the same network. It used datagrams, IPX net buoy datagrams, which is a low level, unreliable protocol. Basically, you can send a packet to someone else. That's it. I mean, you don't even know if they got it or not, but it works 99.9% of the time on a local network just fine. And the client used that to discover which servers existed. And I was thinking about this, and we added this concept of publishing. So in addition to just discovering what servers, why not register with this browser what applications were available and on what servers? So once this browser had that information, it wasn't much of a leap to say, you say, I want to run Word. Okay, Word is available on these 3 servers. So it's not much of a leap to say, okay, each of these servers, why not just report the current load, and that can be defined in many different ways. So these 3 servers would update occasionally the browser with their load. And so now you could pick the server that's the least loaded. So if there were 3 choices, you can now pick one that was the least loaded and then connect the ICA client to that server. And that was the whole idea behind this load balancing. And so I had created this, and the load balancing wasn't in the first product, but it was in the code. It just hadn't been tested well enough. And there were some registry keys that you could tweak to enable it. And the Doug Brown, among others, found out about these, or I probably told them what these registry keys, and they started using this load balancing capability before it was officially available.
Nice. So the answer to his question is not only yes for this capability, but also for maybe a number of other capabilities, features that came in the product. You thought about them so much, you went to bed thinking about them, and then like your subconscious mind or maybe a higher power dropped in the answer, and you got up in the morning with a aha moment.
Yep. I mean, on some occasions, you got to give credit where credit's due. I mean, everyone contributed, and everyone from the SEs. There are a lot of ideas floating. We never had a shortage of ideas.
Well, that's cool that everybody in that community was so open-minded, and they didn't care who had the best idea in the room. They just recognized it, and everybody got behind it and celebrated together. Well, that brings us to number 10.
Hey, Brad. This is Tony Atkins here. Glad to be asking you a question today. My question for you is, what bird that you take photos of today best reminds you of yourself 25 years ago?
What bird?
Way to go, Stoney.
Well, that's a unique question. There's some crazy birds I've seen on the some of my photography trips. All kinds of penguins, but I don't really relate to the penguins. There was a bird on the Falkland Islands. That was penguins. Who knows? I guess an eagle. I like an eagle. I like
There
eagle.
you go. Good answer, man. An eagle does nothing but soar. And yeah, as we started this interview and this presentation and in this podcast out, we looked at your LinkedIn page and you've done nothing but soar. And by the way, this question is also a transition question too, because it brings us into some of the photography that you have taken as it's one of your passions. And maybe as we pop through a few of these slides, you can talk about that.
This was interesting. This was actually a puffin. You don't see them every day. And puffins are great fishermen are fishing. I mean, they basically dive underwater, and they come out, and this is what it looks like. They scoop up all these herring. I believe they're herring. And in particular, this one was up in Grimsey Island. It's north of Iceland. So you fly to Iceland, and then you drive 3 hours to the north side of the island of Iceland, and then you take a ferry to this island. And this island is known for its puffin colonies, and it's pretty amazing. But went there with a group of about a half dozen folks, other photographers.
Oh, so that was it. It was a photography journey. And what kind of gear are you carrying?
Pretty much always use Nikon, and I've migrated over the years, upgrading as Nikon comes out with the new cameras. Nowadays, I shoot with the Z9, which is Nikon's, top of the line, digital.
So you keep the glass, and then you upgrade the body. And
yeah, although when Nikon made the transition to the Z bodies, they changed their mount on the lenses, so you had to buy all new glass.
No adapter?
There wasn't, and there is an adapter. Yeah, and I used that for a while, but I did migrate to the new glass.
Good call. Is that a mirrorless camera?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
beautiful. They're pretty amazing compared to the old film days.
Film and then DSLR and then mirrorless. Yeah, it's crazy. So that's an amazing shot. And if you take a look at the next one here, it looks like it's feeding time.
Yeah, that's up in Michigan. A small lake, middle of nowhere in Michigan. There's families of loons every year. They raise young ones there, and they're so accustomed. Basically, we're on a pontoon boat and floating, with little electric trawler motors.
Yeah.
So we just kind of slowly move around, and we're laying down on the boat, so we get very close to the water and get these types of shots.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. Now this one here, I wouldn't mind getting, nice and close. I'm sure you had a good lens. You didn't have to be that close, but this one here, I'd probably want more distance.
Yeah, these are grizzly bears. This is up in Kodiak, Alaska. So we lived on a boat. Well, we flew into Kodiak Island, and then took a boat from there. It lived on a boat for about a week, and then you'd take a small landing craft. Basically, with the boat, you would go up and down the shoreline until you see bears, and then you take a landing craft in, and you walk around. You keep your distance, but as long as you respect the bears and don't do anything stupid, they're gonna leave you alone. But it's amazing when you have the cubs, the younger bears with a mother bear. You don't want to get between them, that's for sure. These bears are big.
And I didn't at first realize that there was two bears on the right-hand side. I thought that was just an 8-legged bear. But
yeah, you're right.
And then we go on to this smaller dude here, but
yeah, bobcat. Yeah, this was Yellowstone in the winter, which is actually an amazing time to go to Yellowstone. There's a lot of wildlife, and you drive around on a basically I can't remember if this was a tracked vehicle or not. It may have been a tracked vehicle, but some of these roads aren't really open to traffic, normal car traffic, so you got to have the special vehicles. And there's a lot of wildlife, and this was a pretty close encounter. The person leading this photography group has done this many times, and so he knows what he's doing. So when he sees these animals, he can kind of figure out where they're heading. In this case, the bobcat was just kind of following the river behind it, and so we went way downstream and waited, and it walked right past us. So
and looked right at you too.
Yeah, it saw us.
Yeah,
it just kept on walking.
It's bigger than the cat and smaller than a tiger, huh?
Yeah, it's about halfway between.
Yeah. And then you got these guys.
Well, these are huge polar bears. This was actually in northern Canada, north of Churchill. There's a lodge up there that basically this is what the lodge does. The lodge is surrounded. It's not a very big lodge, but it's a very nice lodge. And it's on the lake, but the lake is all frozen. But it's in an area that's polar bears traverse by all the time. And the lodge itself is surrounded by a fence. It's pretty, a strong, high fence. And even with that fence there, you always have to have an escort anytime you leave the building, because these polar bears are nothing to fool around with. I mean, they can be very, very dangerous. Although, again, like most wild animals, they're not aggressive to humans unless they have a reason to be. Very rarely will, bears initiate, an attack. You got to do something stupid. But in any case, when we're out walking, because we do go out walking, outside the protection, we always have multiple guides with us. They have guns if it comes to that, but that's the last recourse. And they have noisemakers. They have bear spray. They have all different things that they've been trained.
Yeah.
But we had some encounters where we were pretty close to the, and you never want to appear aggressive to them.
No.
You just kind of stand your ground, and you stay together as a group. So you look bigger than, if you're off by yourself, you're much more at risk than if you're with a group, because with a group, you got, strength in numbers, and you just look bigger. And so the bears will leave you alone with a bigger group.
And you hope that they're not too hungry that day.
That's the thing with that whole area there. There's lots of food. And so, and the earlier grizzly bears, again, there's a lot of food. They feed with salmon in the river, and so they're not hungry, and they're not looking, for aggressively. They're not looking for humans to eat. Or
a mid-afternoon snack.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hey man, we did it. We got through that tremendous history all the way up through your new passion of taking photography. And is there any last message you want for the folks that are hanging in there watching this whole thing? Any for the Citrites that have been in the community for 30 years, the new engineers coming out of school nowadays looking for guidance? Any last words of wisdom?
To some degree, I'm glad I'm not in the industry anymore, as far as with the whole emergence of AI and AI with coding, and it's interesting. I don't have a lot of, other than what I've played with, I don't have a lot of practical experience with it. But there's predictions out there that 80% of coding is going to be done with AI, shortly, and I'm not sure that's the Citrix type of programming, the type of programming that we're used to, because that is a much higher level than a lot of these, simple IT apps. basically they're presenting database data to, a screen. That I can believe that an AI program could do. But, write a multi-user OS, operating system, I'm not convinced yet.
No, I wouldn't think so. It's interesting with AI, if it gets its hands, figuratively on the code, it can rip through it and kind of make sense of it. So
Yeah.
if you did challenge it with sort of a deep, even a kernel or whatever, if you gave it enough code examples, pretty quickly it might be able to do something that you needed to do. You're always going to need someone to be able to shepherd the AI and work with the code and take it from there. But it is going to reduce the staff size, you would think, pretty soon.
Yeah, you would certainly think so. I got to believe that a lot of the quote simpler stuff can be more automated, and but the thing is, again, just more of my personal experience with AI. It's like you're interacting with someone who thinks they know all the answers, whether they do or not. Hard to tell sometimes. But they certainly believe they do.
And sometimes it's easy to tell. Because you ask it a question and you get a good answer. You ask it another one and it just totally lies to you.
Yeah.
And that's
you get the opposite of what they initially said. And
yeah.
And and each in context, seems believable, but they're contradicting themselves. So, but there's humans that do that too. So, it's nothing real new. But the point is, you got to double check everything. I mean, you got to double and triple check, and it's not the final answer necessarily. It's a data point along your journey, and I think that's true with coding too. It's a data point. It's a way to get to something, but then you got to double check and verify, and then help it along the next step. And so there's a lot of verifying and validation that has to occur along the path.
I think so. And, and we'll see where that goes. We're all keeping an eye on it, and no one really knows. But how about a final message off to the legions of Citrites and partners and, the customers and so forth that have been around Citrix for so long. And I'm sure they're going to love this chance to check in back with you and get some of the backstories. Any words to that community?
I got a number one, thank everyone for sticking with Citrix for so many years. The people that really hung in there, because it wasn't always obvious. So, thanks. And it was because of this community, and it's, much larger than just Citrix, that Citrix succeeded. And that we got to, where we got to, people believing in the products, believing and pushing it and helping it along. You don't get that, always. And in particular, in the early days of Citrix, it was definitely there. There were a lot of people out in the field and believers, and that helped things along. And that, without that, I think we've been telling a very different story.
Everybody played their role in it. Obviously, it's not going to be successful without all the customers and the partner adoption, even like you say, through some of those lean moments. But the brilliant engineers behind it, the folks you worked with, that created the value and stayed with it, and the leadership team and so forth, all the folks that had been there through the years. So thank you, man. When I reached out to see if you'd be up for something like this, wasn't quite sure. I'm definitely glad you were up for it, and you provided me so much material that we could actually follow this beautiful flow and show a lot of imagery and photos from the past and tell the whole story. So yeah, I hope folks are having a great time watching this thing, and I hope they comment. We get a lot of comments and follow up.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll make sure I look for all that stuff, and I'll point you to it if it starts coming in, as I'm sure it will. So thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Brad, for asking me. I was questioning whether it made sense to do this initially, but I'm glad we did. So
you happy with how it turned out?
Well, we'll see if it's not too boring and too rambling, because I have a tendency to kind of ramble on sometimes. But other than that, yeah.
Well, you'd be surprised. Some of the things you ramble on about, folks are going, oh my God, I didn't realize that actually happened. Now it makes so much sense. So they're going to love it. So I would just like to say to all those folks, thanks for watching too. And, of course, huge thank you to Brad Peterson for joining us. And if you've ever used Citrix or built on it, you've felt the impact of his work. And this will continue for years to come, and you guys know that. So if this conversation sparked something within you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others. And until next time, rethink the game and rewrite the rules. Take care, everyone, and bye for now.
Thanks, Brad.